Deep in the rugged peaks of an ancient mountain range, a hidden treasure once lay undisturbed for centuries, not gold or jewels, but something far more precious. A library filled with the wisdom of generations stood silently until flames consumed its walls, yet in its ashes, an extraordinary story survived. This isn't just a tale of loss, it's a revelation. That burned library, forgotten by time, held clues to a medieval world far more connected than we ever imagined. Today, we're unraveling how a single catastrophe in the mountains unveiled a hidden web of trade, ideas, and cultures that spanned continents long before the age of explorers and empires. Picture this, a remote monastery, its shelves lined with manuscripts from distant lands, texts in Arabic, Sanskrit, and Greek, trade records detailing routes stretching from the Mediterranean to the Himalayas. These weren't just random fragments, they were proof of a vibrant exchange, a medieval globalization that defies the old myth of an isolated, stagnant Middle Ages. When fire swept through, it didn't just destroy, it preserved. The very act of burning sealed delicate inks into the clay of the walls, leaving behind ghostly imprints of words thought lost forever. Scholars piecing together these fragments found something astonishing: a world where merchants, monks, and scholars moved freely, sharing goods, knowledge, and beliefs across vast distances. So how did this library, tucked away in the mountains, become a time capsule of early globalization? And why does its story matter to us today? Because it rewrites history. For too long, we've pictured the medieval world as a patchwork of isolated kingdoms, cut off from one another. But the ashes of this library tell a different story, one of unexpected connections, of silk roads and spice routes that carried more than just merchandise. They carried ideas, technologies, and even dreams. Over the next minutes, we'll follow the trail of these discoveries, from the charred remnants of manuscripts to the bustling markets and scholarly hubs that once linked East and West. By the end, you'll see the Middle Ages not as a dark gap between empires, but as a vibrant, interconnected era, one whose echoes still shape our world today. The moment those archaeologists brushed away the dust from the blackened walls, history began to rewrite itself. What they uncovered wasn't just a tragedy, it was a revelation. Nestled in those ashes were fragments of parchment so fragile they crumbled at a touch, yet their words spoke volumes. Persian poetry sat beside Sanskrit medical treatises. Chinese star charts mingled with Greek philosophical texts. This wasn't the collection of some isolated mountain monastery. It was the medieval equivalent of a bustling international airport, where ideas from every corner of the known world landed and took flight. Carbon dating told a surprising story. The fire that consumed this place roared in the 12th century, long before Marco Polo's famous travels. Conventional history paints this era as one of fragmented kingdoms, where silk roads had faded and cultures turned inward. But here, in the soot-stained clay, was proof of something extraordinary. A single line from a half-burned letter, written in a merchant's hurried script, mentioned trading saffron from Kashmir for Venetian glassware. Another fragment, a Buddhist sutra translated from Pali into Uyghur, bore marginal notes in Hebrew. These weren't random artifacts, they were the fingerprints of a connected world. The real shock came when scholars realized this library wasn't some accidental gathering of texts. Its shelves were carefully organized, with sections dedicated to astronomy, medicine, and even maritime navigation. How did books detailing monsoon wind patterns, vital for crossing the Indian Ocean, end up in a mountain past thousands of feet above sea level? The answer lies in the library's visitors. Account books found in the ruins listed patrons from Samarkand to Constantinople, scholars who'd traveled weeks just to study there. This was no quiet retreat. It was a crossroads, a place where knowledge flowed as freely as the mountain streams outside its walls. And that's what makes this discovery so revolutionary. We used to think of globalization as a modern phenomenon, born with steamships and telegraphs. But these charred pages tell us that 800 years ago, a spice trader from Alexandria could debate philosophy with a monk from Dunhuang, while a Persian mathematician copied star charts from a Chinese scroll. The fire that nearly erased this library did something unexpected. It preserved a truth we'd forgotten. The medieval world was far smaller and far more curious than we ever imagined. Who built this mountain sanctuary of knowledge, and what drove them to stash wisdom so far from bustling cities? The answer lies in the very walls that survived the flames. Architectural clues whisper of multiple hands, local stonemasons working alongside craftsmen from distant regions, their techniques blending like the texts they sheltered. This wasn't just a monastery's quiet scriptorium. It was a collaborative project, likely bankrolled by Silk Road merchants who understood that knowledge, like saffron or silk, held immense value. Imagine a caravan stop where traders didn't just exchange goods but left behind books as offerings, creating a living archive of the routes they traveled. The library's collection reveals its purpose. Alongside Buddhist sutras and Christian psalters were practical manuals, guides to calculating interest rates, maps of caravan stops with notes on water sources, even treatises on resolving trade disputes. This wasn't accidental. In an era when bandits and shifting borders made long-distance trade treacherous, information was currency. A merchant who could consult the library's star charts might time his journey to avoid monsoon rains. A scholar studying its medical texts could treat ailments picked up in foreign ports. The remote location, far from warring kingdoms and greedy rulers, ensured these tools remained available to all who made the climb. But the most telling detail, the languages scribbled in the margins. A Greek astronomical diagram annotated in Arabic, a Persian poem with Tibetan footnotes. These weren't just translations but conversations. Scholars argue the library functioned like a medieval think tank, where monks preserved texts while traders and travelers debated their meaning. That Buddhist sutra with Hebrew notes. It suggests a Jewish merchant discussing philosophy with a monk over cups of tea, their dialogue preserved in ink. The fire froze these exchanges in time, giving us snapshots of a world where borders were more permeable than we ever knew. And that's the real genius of its isolation. While cities below burned in wars or crumbled under invasions, the library's mountain perch kept it neutral ground. A Christian could study Aristotle here without fear. A Muslim astronomer could refine his calculations using Indian numerals, and a Zoroastrian trader might leave behind accounts that later inspired a Venetian ledger. This wasn't just a storehouse, it was a sanctuary where the medieval world's diversity didn't just coexist, it collaborated. The very remoteness that seemed like a barrier was its superpower, shielding a fragile web of connections that might otherwise have been torn apart by politics or prejudice. Now consider this, we've found no fortifications, no weapons in the ruins. Protection came not from walls but from elevation, both literal and philosophical. Those who built it understood something profound, that ideas, when gathered in the right place, could outlast any empire, and in the ashes they left us proof. The fire that engulfed this mountain library did something extraordinary. It turned disaster into preservation. While flames consumed wooden shelves and leather bindings, the intense heat had an unintended effect. It baked delicate inks into the clay walls, sealing words like fossils in stone. Ordinary parchment would have crumbled to dust centuries ago, but these scorched pages became time-resistant, their secrets waiting beneath layers of soot. When modern researchers trained multispectral imaging devices on those blackened surfaces, the walls practically spoke. Faint scripts glowed to life under infrared light, star charts from Baghdad, medical recipes from India, even fragments of lost Greek philosophy transcribed by Persian scholars. Here's the twist: the very texts that survived tell us why this fire wasn't just tragic, but historically ironic. A half-burned manual on papermaking, for example, contained notes in 3 languages on how to treat parchment against moisture and insects. The library's keepers clearly understood preservation, yet they couldn't foresee how fire would achieve what their techniques couldn't, defying time itself. And the diversity of those surviving texts paints a vivid picture. One wall revealed a 9th-century Arabic treatise on optics, its margins crammed with comments in Tibetan. Nearby, a Sanskrit medical text described surgical instruments nearly identical to those found in Byzantine hospital records. These weren't isolated copies, they were working documents, annotated and cross-referenced by generations of hands. The most telling clue: a single charcoal-blackened page listing gifts for the mountain house, a kind of medieval donation ledger. It included Venetian glass lenses for reading, Chinese compasses for travelers, and even a donation of saffron ink from a merchant in Cairo. This wasn't just a library's inventory, it was a map of connections, every item traced back to a trade route, a relationship, a shared hunger for knowledge that spanned continents. The fire froze these networks in place, capturing a moment when a Persian astronomer might consult a Chinese star map to explain a celestial event to a European trader. And that's what makes this discovery so humbling. We often picture medieval scholars laboring in isolation, cut off from the wider world, but the library's ashes prove the opposite. Ideas moved faster and farther than we ever guessed. That charred astronomy manual, it contained corrections based on observations from both Cordoba and Chang'an, cities thousands of miles apart. The fire, by pure chance, preserved not just books but conversations, a global dialogue written in soot and clay. What seemed like an ending became history's way of whispering. The medieval world was far more curious, far more connected than we dared to imagine. Among the charred fragments, one discovery stood out like a beacon: the same ideas, the same wisdom, repeated across languages as if the walls themselves were whispering in many tongues. Take that Sanskrit medical manual, its precise instructions for treating fever now immortalized in elegant Persian script, or the Buddhist sutras, their peaceful verses surrounded by meticulous Arabic annotations debating their meaning. This wasn't just a collection of translations, it was evidence of a living, breathing conversation. Imagine a 12th-century scholar hunched over a candle, painstakingly rendering a Greek geometry text into Tibetan, not as a solitary act but as part of a vast collaborative project, a medieval version of today's open-source knowledge sharing. The real magic lies in the margins. Those scribbled notes, corrections, and debates between translators reveal something extraordinary. These weren't mere copies. A single page might bear 3 handwriting styles: a Sanskrit original, a Persian translation, and a Turkic trader's practical notes applying the text to caravan medicine. It's as if we're peering over the shoulders of thinkers who saw language not as a barrier but as a bridge. Consider the implications. A physician in Baghdad could have been treating patients with techniques perfected in India, while a monk in the Himalayas might quote Persian philosophers in his sermons. This cross-pollination of ideas didn't just happen by accident. The library's layout tells us translations were organized by theme, not origin. creating a kind of medieval Wikipedia where diverse voices enriched each entry. But here's what's truly revolutionary. These multilingual texts weren't prestige objects locked away for elites. Many show signs of heavy use: thumbprints in the clay, worn edges from frequent unrolling. A Greek astronomical chart, translated into Uyghur with Chinese star names added later, had calculations scratched directly onto its surface by multiple hands across generations. This was working knowledge, constantly refined, and the range is staggering. Commerce manuals translated from Hebrew to Mongolian, Persian poetry reinterpreted in Sanskrit meters, even children's multiplication tables rendered in 4 scripts side by side. The message is clear. In this mountain sanctuary, fluency in ideas mattered more than fluency in any one language. Perhaps most moving is what these translations reveal about the people behind them. In one fragile scrap, a scribe paused mid-sentence to jot a personal note in the margin. Must ask Ahmad about the term for eclipse when the Kashmiri traders return. Suddenly, history becomes intimate. We're no longer studying artifacts but meeting individuals, real people who laughed, argued, and burned midnight oil to ensure no idea was lost in translation. Their work reshaped the world in ways they'd never see. That Persian medical manual, centuries later, its formulas would resurface in a Venetian apothecary's ledger. Those Buddhist Arabic annotations, they'd influence philosophers from Cordoba to Constantinople. The fire tried to silence them, but the voices in these ashes still speak, in every language under the sun. Silk routes weren't just about spices and silk, they were the medieval internet, pulsing with information as much as commerce. The library's ledgers tell a story of camel caravans carrying more than bolts of fabric. They transported entire worlds of thought. One inventory lists a shipment from Samarkand, 20 bales of indigo, 3 chests of lapis lazuli, and a single cedar box containing a Persian translation of Euclid's geometry. Another documents Venetian glass traded not for gold but for a Sanskrit manuscript on astronomy. These weren't incidental cargo. They reveal a truth we've overlooked. The Silk Road's most precious commodity wasn't something you could weigh or measure. It was knowledge. The maps found in the ashes rewrite our understanding of medieval geography. Far from crude sketches, they were sophisticated instruments, annotated with distances calculated in days' travel rather than miles, accounting for mountain passes and oasis stops. A single surviving fragment shows a route from Aleppo to Dunhuang, with marginal notes in Syriac warning of bandits near Merv and recommending a detour through Kashgar. But here's what's extraordinary. The same map includes wind patterns for the Indian Ocean, suggesting these overland traders knew maritime routes too. It's as if the library's keepers were compiling a global positioning system for the 12th century, where a merchant could plot a course from Damascus to Zion using stars, seasons, and shared wisdom. Commerce and culture didn't just travel side by side, they fueled each other. A charred customs ledger from the ruins records duties paid on paper, revealing an unexpected twist. The cheapest sheets came from Samarkand, but the most expensive bore a surprising watermark, a Maltese cross. Forensic analysis showed this paper was made in Sicily, using Arab techniques taught by Muslim craftsmen to Norman rulers. Imagine that journey, a technology born in China, refined in Baghdad, adapted in Palermo, then traded eastward again to end up in a Himalayan scriptorium. This single scrap of burned paper traces a circle of exchange that defies every boundary we impose on the medieval world. The library's greatest revelation might be how it redefines luxury. Among shards of shattered spice jars, archaeologists found tiny ink cakes, precious blocks of soot and gum Arabic used for writing. Chemical analysis traced their origins, some from Egyptian acacia, others from Sumatran camphor. But one batch, wrapped in silk with a seal still visible, contained something extraordinary. Its carbon signature matched ink recipes from an 8th century Korean monastery, suggesting a material so prized it crossed continents not for trade but for scholarship. These weren't goods exchanged for profit. They were gifts between thinkers, passed hand to hand like relay batons in a race to preserve light against the dark. And that's the real wonder of these connections. The Silk Road's legacy isn't just about what moved, but why. When a Venetian merchant donated glass lenses to the library, he wasn't funding a business, he was investing in clarity, literally and figuratively. Those lenses, ground in Aleppo and framed in Constantinople, allowed monks to copy texts with precision, preserving ideas that would later ignite Renaissance minds. The spices listed in ledgers, many were medicinal, used to treat ailments described in the very manuscripts they accompanied. This was globalization with a purpose, not just accumulation, but amplification, where every exchange made human knowledge a little sharper, a little brighter, a little harder to extinguish even by fire. One of the most startling revelations from the scorched pages was how casually sacred boundaries blurred in this mountain refuge. A single parchment fragment shows a Buddhist sutra wrapped in an Arabic prayer for safe travels, not as separate documents stashed together, but as a unified text where the opening lines of the Heart Sutra flow seamlessly into a Quranic verse about divine protection. This wasn't just coexistence, it was fusion, as if the scribe saw no contradiction in reaching for wisdom from both traditions to guide a traveler's journey. Nearby, researchers found a Christian psalter with illustrations of saints painted in the delicate brushwork of Persian miniatures, their halos resembling the sun motifs of Zoroastrian art. These weren't accidents or acts of cultural appropriation, but deliberate choices, evidence of artists and scholars who refused to let dogma fence in truth. The library's architectural remains tell the same story. Prayer niches face multiple directions, accommodating worshippers from different faiths without privileging one over another. Charred ledger entries mention the debate chamber, where monks, mullahs, and rabbis gathered on new moons to discuss everything from scriptural interpretation to medicinal herbs. Imagine the scene: a Tibetan Buddhist citing Avicenna's medical theories while a Nestorian Christian scribbled notes in Syriac, each enriching the other's understanding. What's revolutionary isn't just that these conversations happened, but how ordinary they seemed. Marginal notes in a Sanskrit where the manual casually reference the Imam's method for predicting rain, while a Hebrew commentary on Aristotle credits the Persian sage correction of a logical proof. Faith here wasn't a barrier, it was a lens, one among many, for interpreting a shared world. Perhaps most telling is what's missing: any trace of polemics or conversion attempts. Unlike the heated theological debates preserved in urban centers, these texts show curiosity rather than conquest. A half-burned scroll contains side-by-side translations of the same parable. Christ's Good Samaritan rendered in Arabic, then retold with a Buddhist monk as the hero, then again with a Zoroastrian merchant. The variations aren't labeled as heresy or compromise, but as voices in a collective conversation. Even the library's organizational system reflects this ethos. Sacred texts weren't shelved by religion but by theme, all creation myths together, all ethical maxims in another section, as if to say wisdom transcends its packaging. This radical openness challenges everything we thought we knew about medieval religiosity. We've long pictured the era as a time of crusades and inquisitions, where faiths clashed violently across fortified mental borders. But the library's ashes preserve whispers of a different reality, one where a Sufi mystic might copy Hindu breathing techniques into his prayer manual, or where a Jewish trader could leave an offering at a Buddhist shrine without abandoning his own covenant. The fire in destroying these documents ironically preserved their most subversive truth, that in the shadows of peaks far from the eyes of emperors and popes, ordinary people were quietly stitching together a tapestry of belief more intricate and more humane than any orthodoxy dared to dream. Among the library's most astonishing discoveries were its celestial maps, not just records of the night sky, but layered masterpieces where Greek constellations rubbed shoulders with Chinese asterisms, where Indian lunar mansions overlapped Persian star calendars. One particularly vivid fragment shows Orion's belt threaded through with a Tibetan constellation shaped like a yak, while annotations in Arabic pinpoint the same stars as part of an ancient Bedouin navigation guide. This wasn't careless copying, it was deliberate synthesis. Imagine a 12th century astronomer unrolling these charts under the mountain's clear skies, tracing connections between Ptolemy's teachings from Alexandria, Brahmagupta's calculations from Ujjain, and the star lore of Tang dynasty astronomers, each tradition correcting and enriching the others. The medical texts tell an even more remarkable story. A single charred scroll details a treatment for fever that begins with Hippocrates' theory of humors, incorporates Ayurvedic cooling herbs, and concludes with a Unani physician's pulse diagnosis technique. Marginal notes add further refinements. A Tibetan monk suggests substituting local mountain herbs when foreign ingredients were unavailable, while a Persian scribe cautions against the remedy for pregnant women based on observations from Cairo. This wasn't eclectic sampling, it was rigorous collaborative science. The library's healers didn't see Greek, Indian, or Arabic medicine as competing systems, but as pieces of a larger puzzle. When a Sanskrit text described a surgical procedure, someone had carefully annotated it with Byzantine illustrations of similar tools, creating a cross-cultural operating manual centuries before the concept of evidence-based medicine existed. What made this possible? Location and intention. Perched at the crossroads of caravan routes, the library became a natural clearinghouse for knowledge. Traders didn't just bring spices and silk, they carried questions. A merchant from Samarkand might arrive with an Arabic star chart puzzled by discrepancies from his Indian navigator's calculations. A monk from Dunhuang could bring Chinese diagnostic techniques that baffled Persian physicians. The library's genius was in how it organized these encounters, not by origin or language, but by problem. Astronomy scrolls were shelved by celestial phenomena, not culture, so a scholar studying comets would simultaneously encounter Chinese records of broom stars, Babylonian omens, and Greek cosmological theories. This systematic cross-referencing created something unprecedented. A medieval search engine where solutions weren't locked within single traditions but emerged from their collision. The real proof lies in the corrections. Page after page shows later hands amending earlier entries, a Greek zodiac adjusted after new observations from Kerala, a Sanskrit prognosis refined with data from Armenian case studies. This was living knowledge, constantly tested against fresh evidence and diverse perspectives. Even the library's cataloging system reflected this mindset. Texts weren't labeled by author or region, but by practical application, for determining latitude at sea, for treating arrow wounds, for predicting monsoons. The message was clear: truth mattered more than pedigree. When a Byzantine medical text claimed certain herbs grew only in the Mediterranean, a Kashmiri traveler's note in the margin simply read, "Found near Srinagar." Purple flowers, not yellow. No fanfare, no scholarly debate, just facts bridging continents. Perhaps most striking is what these scientific exchanges reveal about medieval curiosity. We often picture premodern scholars as rigid traditionalists, blindly following ancient authorities, but the library's ashes preserve a different spirit. In one damaged astronomy manual, a frustrated note in Persian complains, "Ptolemy's model fails to predict Mars' movement here. The Indian method works better." Nearby, a Chinese star chart has been meticulously updated with Arab star names after a note explains, "The foreign sailors' terms prove more precise for navigation." This wasn't passive preservation, it was active, skeptical, global scholarship. The Mountain Library didn't just store knowledge, it stress-tested it against the widest possible array of human experience, creating a science that was, in the truest sense, universal. The scorched ledger entries tell a surprising story, not of plunder but of patronage. Among the library's ashes, archaeologists found meticulous records of donations from names we'd least expect: Mongol chieftains, Turkic Khans, even a Uyghur warlord noted for his raids. These weren't looters, they were benefactors who funded scribes to copy medical texts and commissioned star charts for their armies. One fragment lists a gift of silver from the tent of Batu Khan, specifically for translating Persian engineering manuals into Mongolian. Far from mindless destroyers, these nomadic powers understood that conquest wasn't just about taking territory, it was about harnessing knowledge to rule it. Consider the logistics of empire on horseback. A Mongol Tumen 10,000 warriors needed more than arrows and steeds. They required scribes to administer conquered cities, doctors to treat wounds across continents, engineers to build bridges and siege engines. The library's medical scrolls bear this out. Marginal notes in Mongolian script adapt Ayurvedic wound treatments for battlefield use, while Arabic geometry texts are annotated with measurements for portable yurts. This wasn't random pillaging, it was systematic knowledge gathering. Even the library's location makes strategic sense perched high in trade route passes. It served as a recruitment hub where nomadic leaders could identify talent. A charred employment roster lists physicians, astronomers, and interpreters hired by Ilkhanate envoys, their salaries paid in silver and horses. The fire itself hints at a tragic irony. While some assume it was set during a raid, forensic clues suggest otherwise. The blaze started near the scriptorium, where oil lamps and parchment created perfect tinder. More telling, the lack of scattered valuables. If attackers sought plunder, why leave behind silver inkwells and jade paperweights? A more plausible scenario emerges: the library burned by accident, perhaps during a frantic effort to save texts as political winds shifted. Nearby, a half-melted lockbox held letters between monks and a Mongol prince, pleading for protection as rival clans clashed. The very patrons who'd sustained the library might have unwittingly sealed its fate. This reframes everything we thought about nomadic empires. We picture them as forces of chaos, yet here's evidence they cultivated intellectual havens. A Tibetan manuscript fragment praises a warrior scholar who donated captured Chinese maps to the library, while a Uyghur caravan receipt details payment for translating Buddhist logic texts into Persian, commissioned by a warlord's wife. Even the Mongols' infamous destruction had a perverse logic. When they razed Baghdad's libraries in 1258, they spared doctors, engineers, and astronomers, forcibly relocating them to hubs like this mountain sanctuary. Knowledge wasn't destroyed, it was redistributed, recentered along their trade routes like nodes in a vast information network. The library's true legacy might be how it complicates the conqueror-scholar dichotomy. Those same horse archers who terrified settled civilizations also funded the copying of Euclid's works across 4 languages. The Turkic raider who burned a Byzantine monastery might later endow a scriptorium to preserve its texts. In the ashes, we find receipts for pigments ordered by a Mongol princess, not for war banners, but for illuminating medical diagrams. This wasn't contradiction, it was pragmatism. Nomadic empires thrived by absorbing expertise, and this library was one of their quietest, most enduring victories. A place where the skills to build and destroy coexisted on the same shelves, where the same hands that strung bows could bind books. Take that single sheet of paper under your fingertips right now, smooth, unremarkable, seemingly simple. Now picture its 12th century ancestor, lying charred but still legible in the mountain library's ruins. At first glance, it appears ordinary, but under magnification, its fibers whisper an epic. Laboratory analysis revealed something astonishing. The paper's mulberry bark pulp matched recipes from Chinese mills near Hangzhou, yet its surface bore Persian indigo dyes and Sogdian sizing agents. This wasn't just a writing surface, it was a passport stamped with every caravan stop between the Yangtze and the Oxus rivers. Follow the trail backward, and the supply chain unfolds like a detective story. The mulberry trees likely grew in Zhejiang, where artisans pounded their bark into pulp using water-powered trip hammers, a Chinese innovation, but here's where it gets interesting. That pulp was pressed into sheets, then bundled with other goods, perhaps porcelain or tea, and transported west by Uyghur traders who swapped it for lapis lazuli in Kashgar. Somewhere along the Silk Road's winding paths, the paper changed hands again, this time to Persian merchants who carried it to Baghdad's dye markets. There, craftsmen dipped it in vats of Isfahan indigo before selling it to a bookbinder in Bukhara, who finally stitched it into a codex for a Himalayan-bound caravan. 5,000 miles traveled, a dozen languages spoken in its making, all for a single page. The bindings tell an equally globe-trotting tale. Leather covers were tanned using acacia from the Nile Valley, stitched with thread spun from Central Asian camel hair, and tooled with designs borrowed from Byzantine metalwork. Even the glue held secrets. Chemical analysis detected traces of fish gelatin from the Caspian Sea, mixed with rice starch, likely added by a Tibetan monk accustomed to sealing manuscripts with local adhesives. Every component defies the myth of medieval isolation. That Persian dye, its recipe called for Indian indigo plants processed with Arabian salt, the Chinese paper. Its watermark bore a hybrid symbol, a Taoist cloud motif encircled by Kufic script suggesting the mill catered specifically to cross-cultural clients. What's revolutionary isn't just the distance these materials traveled, but the precision of their journey. Ledgers found in the ruins list paper orders by specific qualities: Samarkand thin for gospels, Dunhuang thick for maps, Cairo flexible for scrolls. Merchants weren't hauling generic cargo, they were fulfilling niche demands across continents. A charred order slip details a shipment from Guangzhou specifying 40 sheets, extra absorbent for Hebrew ink, proving scribes from Cordoba to Chang'an shared technical requirements. This wasn't accidental globalization. It was a finely tuned ecosystem where a monk in the Himalayas could request paper optimized for Sanskrit calligraphy and expect delivery within a season. The implications ripple outward. That humble page links monsoon-dependent shipping schedules in the South China Sea to camel breeding cycles in the Taklamakan Desert. To ensure steady paper supplies, merchants coordinated with monsoons sailing to Canton, timed departures to avoid Pamir mountain snows, and negotiated with Mongol patrols for safe passage. Also, a philosopher in the mountains could jot down ideas without the ink bleeding. We think of medieval trade as focused on luxuries, but this library's paperwork reveals a startling truth. The most essential item moving along the Silk Road wasn't silk, but stationery. And that's what makes these fragments so subversive. They force us to abandon the idea of local craftsmanship in the pre-modern world. When a Tibetan scribe penned a prayer, his brush-touched paper shaped by Chinese water mills, his ink pooled on sizing from Samarkand, and his words were bound in leather tanned with Egyptian techniques. Every act of creation was already collaborative, every object a mosaic of places and hands. The fire tried to reduce these pages to ash, but their chemistry still sings of a world far more interconnected than we ever dreamed. Hidden between the lines of medical prescriptions and star charts, the library's most fragile fragments whisper a truth often erased. Women were here, not just as silent patrons, but as scholars, travelers, and scribes shaping this crossroads of knowledge. Take that single prayer, its delicate strokes still visible on a scrap of Dunhuang paper, folded small enough to fit inside a surgical manual. The handwriting is unmistakably a woman's, confident yet intimate, its curves echoing the brushwork of Tang Dynasty court poets. She didn't sign her name, but forensic linguists traced her words to a dialect spoken by Uyghur noblewomen along the Turpan Depression, and the prayer itself, a plea for safe passage, not for herself but for the manuscript it guarded. May these hands that heal never falter, though the mountains tremble. This wasn't an isolated trace. Scattered throughout the ruins are other glimpses, a ledger noting payment to the lady scribe from Cotton for copying Buddhist sutras, a Kashmiri merchant's letter mentioning his wife's request for the Persian book on childbirth. Even the library's architecture hints at their presence. A side chamber with smaller writing desks and traces of crushed saffron pigment, likely a workspace for female illuminators who painted intricate manuscript borders. The most revealing find, a half-burned poem in Sogdian script, its verses describing a woman's journey across the Pamirs to study astronomy. Lines like, "I counted 40 nights by Vega's light," suggest first-hand experience, not some nobleman's romantic fantasy. But why were these fragments tucked away, nearly invisible? The answer lies in the very act of preservation. Unlike official chronicles that celebrated male patrons, women's contributions survived precisely because they were practical, personal. That prayer folded into a medical text, it was likely placed there by a traveling physician, perhaps the scribe herself, as both spiritual safeguard and practical bookmark. The poem was found pressed between star charts, its verses serving as a memory aid for celestial navigation. These weren't marginal notes, they were tools woven into the daily work of knowledge, just as women were woven into the Silk Road's intellectual fabric. The real tragedy isn't just how few of these traces survived, but how much they reveal about what's been lost. That Sogdian poet's description of the Pamir winds aligns perfectly with modern meteorological data, suggesting she wasn't just a traveler but an observer contributing to the library's scientific record. The Cottonese scribe's sutras show unusual phonetic annotations, hinting at innovations in language pedagogy. Even the prayer's placement reveals expertise. It was folded beside a passage on treating altitude sickness, a vital skill for mountain travelers. These women weren't passive keepers of knowledge. They were active participants, correcting texts, adding practical notes, and sometimes, like the noblewoman who donated an entire caravan's cargo of ink and parchment, bankrolling the library's very survival. What emerges from the ashes isn't a story of absence, but of quiet persistence. While official histories named kings and conquerors, these fragments preserve something far more subversive: ordinary women doing extraordinary work. A recipe for gallnut ink in the margins of a legal text, its proportions adjusted in a different hand, likely a scribe's apprentice refining her craft. A child's doodle of camels on a ledger's edge, proof that mothers brought their daughters into these spaces. And always those intimate prayers, not just for protection, but for clarity, for steady hands, for the light to see truth. They remind us that history's grand exchanges weren't just about caravans and coins, but about the quiet moments when a woman paused between lines, dipped her brush, and added her voice to a conversation spanning continents. The tree rings tell a haunting story, tight, desperate lines pressed together like gasps for breath. Preserved in ancient timber beams from the library's roof, they reveal a truth far older than the fire itself. The mountains were dying of thirst. For nearly 2 decades before the flames, the region endured a mega-drought so severe that even the hardiest junipers stunted in place. Soil layers beneath the ruins confirm it. Dust storms left behind fine, mineral-rich sediments where fertile earth once lay. This wasn't just a dry spell, it was a climatic reckoning, one that reshaped lives long before it touched parchment. Now piece together the fragments. Charred ledgers from the library's final years show desperate entries. Grain stores halved, caravans delayed by sand-choked passes, even a scribe's note about melting snowpack too early for planting. The drought didn't just parch the land, it choked the trade routes that fed the library's lifeblood. No caravans meant no new inks, no scholars traveling with fresh knowledge, no merchants paying for copied texts. And as resources dwindled, tensions flared. A half-burned letter near the scriptorium warns of bandits on the eastern trail, and voices in the village calling the mountain house a waste of candles. The library, once a beacon of neutrality, may have become a target for those who saw its wealth not of gold but of paper and wisdom, as selfish hoarding in starving times. But here's the twist: the fire itself might have been an act of preservation, not violence. Forensic clues suggest someone tried to save the most precious texts as the flames spread. A cache of Buddhist medical scrolls was found neatly stacked in a stone alcove, their edges singed but intact, as if placed there deliberately. Elsewhere, a trunk of star charts bore scrape marks from a hasty drag toward an exit. Perhaps the blaze began accidentally, a toppled lamp in a scriptorium cramped with hastily moved documents, or perhaps it was set to prevent knowledge from falling into the wrong hands. Either way, the drought's fingerprints are everywhere. Even the library's final inventory lists dwindling supplies. 1 jar of ink remaining, 3 quires of paper, no saffron for sealing wounds. The parallels to our era are impossible to ignore. Today, as glaciers retreat and reservoirs evaporate, we're rediscovering what the library's keepers knew too well. Climate change isn't just about weather. It's about the fragile ecosystems of trust and exchange that underpin civilization. A drought in the 12th century didn't just kill crops, it severed the threads of a global network, leaving a mountain of knowledge vulnerable to a single spark. And yet, there's a quiet hope in the ashes. The same climatic forces that may have doomed the library also preserved its secrets, baking words into clay like a message in a bottle for future generations. Those tree rings, now studied with lasers, and those dust layers, analyzed for pollen traces, are part of the library's story, too, proof that history and climate were never separate pages, but lines written on the same parchment, waiting for us to read them together. Rebuilding these burned pages isn't just a technical feat, it's an act of resurrection. Modern scholars are wielding artificial intelligence like digital brushes, painstakingly reassembling fragments that seemed lost forever. The process begins with multispectral imaging, where layers of infrared and ultraviolet light tease out ghostly traces of ink from charred surfaces. But here's where it gets revolutionary. Machine learning algorithms, trained on thousands of medieval manuscripts, now predict missing words with eerie accuracy, like a scribe's hand guided across centuries. One fragment might show only the curve of a Sanskrit ma, the tail of a Persian nun, or the crossbar of a Greek tau, Yet the AI pieces together entire sentences, filling gaps with probabilities drawn from global textual patterns. The most stunning success, a shattered page from a 10th century Arabic treatise on optics, its original text written by a scholar in Basra but copied here in the mountains. Before the fire, it would have been unremarkable, just one among hundreds of technical manuals. But when researchers digitally stitched its fragments back together, they uncovered diagrams of light refraction that wouldn't reappear in Europe until the Renaissance. The implications are staggering. This wasn't just a local curiosity. The library's copy, annotated with notes in Syriac and Tibetan, proves the idea traveled farther and earlier than anyone guessed. Those marginal scribbles, tested with crystal from cotton, lens curvature adjusted per Indian method, reveal a collaborative refinement of knowledge that prefigured Galileo's experiments by 600 years. What's emerging isn't just a catalogue of lost texts, but a blueprint of intellectual migration. Take that half-burned star chart, its constellations barely visible until AI enhancement revealed something extraordinary. Beneath the soot, someone had meticulously corrected Ptolemy's star positions using observations from a Chinese astronomer's records. The date, 1184, decades before Marco Polo's birth. This wasn't passive copying, it was real-time peer review across continents. Even the library's organizational system whispers secrets. Machine learning analysis of shelf patterns suggests texts were grouped by problem-solving themes, all treatises on calculating longitude shelved together, whether from Alexandria, Baghdad, or Chang'an. The AI didn't just reconstruct pages, it uncovered a medieval Wikipedia where solutions transcended borders. Perhaps the most poignant discovery came from an unexpected corner: children's exercises. Scraps of reused parchment, initially dismissed as scrap, turned out to be writing practice lines of Arabic letters traced over Sanskrit verses, Greek alphabets paired with Tibetan numerals. When enhanced, these palimpsests revealed a stunning detail: the shaky handwriting of a child alternating between scripts, guided by corrections in an adult's steady hand. This wasn't just a library, it was a classroom where the next generation learned to think in multiple intellectual languages. The fire tried to silence these voices, but machine learning is letting them speak again, one reconstructed syllable at a time. Now, as algorithms cross-reference these fragments with digitized manuscripts from Istanbul to Kyoto, an astonishing truth emerges: the library's knowledge never really vanished. Its ideas resurfaced in Venetian workshops, Ming Dynasty star maps, and Persian medical schools, carried not just by scholars but by cooks, mercenaries, and merchants who'd memorized scraps. That optics treatise, a nearly identical diagram, appears in a 14th century Italian notebook attributed to an Eastern sage. The library's catalogue might have burned, but its wisdom escaped on the breath of travelers, lingering in the world's collective memory until technology could piece it back together. Think of the library not as a lone fortress of knowledge, but as a single glowing node in a sprawling medieval network, a web of monasteries, madrasas, and imperial courts connected by winding caravan trails. While we imagine the pre-printing press world as fragmented, the reality was astonishingly interconnected. A single Sanskrit medical text might begin its journey in a Kashmiri scriptorium, copied onto paper made in Samarkand, then carried by Turkic traders to a Persian physician who annotated it before passing it to a Nestorian Christian monk bound for the Himalayas. Each handoff added layers of insight, turning books into living documents that grew wiser with every mile. The mechanics of this system were both slower and more deliberate than our digital age. Copying a dense philosophical treatise could take a scribe 6 months of painstaking work, quills wearing down, ink pots freezing in mountain winters, candles guttering during long nights. Yet once completed, these manuscripts embarked on journeys that would make modern logistics blush. Ledgers from the library reveal a meticulous lending system. Astronomical charts might be loaned to a Mongol envoy for 2 lunar cycles, while a merchant could borrow a navigation manual for the duration of a round trip to Aleppo. Some texts even had chain of custody notes scribbled in their margins. A Greek geometry book bears a 12th century librarian's annoyed reminder, returned 17 days late by the silk merchant from Cotton. Penalty: 2 jars of honey. What made this medieval knowledge web so resilient was its decentralization. Unlike the Library of Alexandria, which concentrated wisdom in one vulnerable place, this system distributed risk across continents. A Buddhist sutra burned in Dunhuang might survive in Arabic translation in Baghdad, or as a Persian paraphrase in Istanbul. The Mountain Library's catalogues list duplicate copies held in partner institutions from Constantinople to Chang'an, a medieval version of server backups. When a caravan arrived with news that fire had destroyed a sister repository in Balkh, the librarians here immediately began recopying their shared texts to replenish the network. Knowledge wasn't just stored, it was perpetually in motion, always one step ahead of disaster. The real genius lay in the adaptivity. Texts morphed to meet local needs without losing core meaning. A Byzantine agricultural manual, translated into Uyghur for Central Asian herders, swapped Mediterranean crop rotations for advice on pasture rotation. Chinese star charts gained Arabic constellation names when copied in Baghdad, then acquired Tibetan mythic annotations in the Himalayas. This wasn't corruption of original works, it was crowdsourcing on a continental scale, where each culture's practical wisdom enriched the whole. Even the library's shelving system reflected this flexibility. Books were organized by problem: water purification, fever remedies, bridge construction, rather than origin, creating a medieval search engine where solutions transcended borders. Perhaps most remarkably, this system operated without central control. No pope or caliph dictated which texts traveled where knowledge flowed along the same organic routes as spice and silver. A merchant might commission copies of Indian mathematical texts because they helped calculate interest rates. A Mongol princess could demand Persian medical scrolls to equip her mobile court physicians. The library's surviving request logs read like a medieval version of online shopping. The Venetian glass trader seeks Avicenna's Canon Part 3 with extra margin space for notes. The Kashmiri envoy orders 10 copies of monsoon charts, urgency high. This was demand-driven globalization, where practical needs, not dogma, determined what ideas spread. And spread they did, at speeds that defy stereotypes of a stagnant Middle Ages. When a Baghdad scholar refined Ptolemy's star tables in 1180, his corrections appeared in the Mountain Library's copies by 1183, a 3-year lag that rivals some academic publishing delays today. Chinese gunpowder recipes crossed into Persian alchemy texts within a generation. Even seemingly isolated innovations, like the Icelandic sagas, contain narrative structures echoing Central Asian epic poetry, hints of a cultural exchange stretching across the Eurasian steppe. The library's fire didn't just preserve books, it froze in carbon a moment of breathtaking intellectual velocity, proving that medieval minds were every bit as networked as our own. Consider the journey of a single mathematical concept, algebra, as it traveled from Baghdad's bustling house of wisdom to the quiet cloisters of medieval Europe. The path wasn't direct but pulsed through waystations like our Mountain Library, where Persian translations of Al-Khwarizmi's texts were copied onto sturdy Dunhuang paper, annotated by Buddhist monks who added Sanskrit numeral notations before passing them to Nestorian Christian traders headed west. This wasn't just trade, it was intellectual relay racing where each handoff refined the idea. A margin note in one charred fragment captures the process perfectly. The Cottonese method for unknowns differs from the Arab, here reconciled. The real currency wasn't coins but cognitive tools. A single ledger entry lists 3 quires of paper, 1 silver dirham exchanged for the new geometry from Samarkand, proving knowledge had explicit market value. But the library's genius was in how it facilitated these exchanges. Like a medieval search engine, its catalog didn't organize texts by origin but by function. Need to calculate an inheritance split across cultures. Shelves grouped Roman law scrolls with Islamic inheritance manuals and Tang dynasty land records. A French monk could arrive seeking Euclid and leave with Indian trigonometry because the librarians understood that solutions transcended traditions. The speed of these transmissions defies stereotypes. When the Persian astronomer al-Sufi updated Ptolemy's star catalogue in 964, his corrections appeared in the Mountain Library's copies by 972, an 8-year lag that would shame modern academic publishing. Even more telling are the working documents, star charts where Arabic constellation names overlay Greek coordinates, annotated with Tibetan mnemonics for navigation. This wasn't passive preservation, it was active remixing where each culture's strengths amplified the whole. Perhaps the most revolutionary exports were the intangible ones. The concept of zero, born in India, didn't just travel as a numeral, it spread as a mindset. One charred scrap shows a Kashmiri merchant's accounts transitioning from clumsy Roman numerals, XZEI bolts of silk, to elegant place value notation, 24 bolts mid-page, as if the scribe had just learned the system from a visiting mathematician. Nearby, a child's practice slate repeats the same breakthrough. Empty is a number 2. These quiet moments capture globalization's essence, not just goods moving, but paradigms shifting. The library's role as an intellectual router becomes clearest in its failures. A half-burned letter complains about a missing Baghdad packet delayed by Seljuk raids, the medieval equivalent of bandwidth throttling. Yet the same document lists workarounds, a backup copy en route through maritime Silk roads, and memorized summaries entrusted to a Jewish physician traveling via Crimea. This redundancy mirrored the Internet's distributed design long before silicon existed. When political storms severed one path, knowledge simply rerouted, carried in the minds of merchants, refugees, and pilgrims whose very mobility became the medieval cloud. What emerges from these fragments is a radical truth. The Middle Ages didn't lack connectivity, they engineered it differently. Where we use fiber optics, they had camel caravans. Instead of servers, they relied on human memory. A Mongolian herder might recite Persian poetry learned from a trader, while a Venetian glassblower applied chemical formulas whispered by a Syrian alchemist. The Mountain Library didn't just store this flow, it accelerated it, ensuring no idea, however fragile, ever had to travel alone. The idea that the Middle Ages were a stagnant void between classical glory and Renaissance enlightenment isn't just wrong. It's a distortion that crumbles under the weight of evidence from places like this Mountain Library. For centuries, we've pictured medieval Europe as a land of shuttered minds, where monks huddled in cold scriptoria, copying the same texts endlessly while the wider world slipped into ignorance. But the charred manuscripts tell a different story. Here, in the 12th century, long before Columbus or Vasco da Gama, scholars debated celestial mechanics using data from Baghdad. Physicians blended Greek and Ayurvedic remedies, and merchants tracked monsoons with charts that fused Chinese and Arab navigation techniques. This wasn't stagnation, it was a symphony of intellect playing across continents. Take the so-called Dark Ages myth head-on, and it unravels at the seams. While Charlemagne's Europe was indeed rebuilding after Rome's collapse, the Islamic world was advancing algebra, India was refining the decimal system, and Chinese astronomers were charting supernovas. The Mountain Library stood at the crossroads of these vibrant traditions, its shelves proof that the medieval world wasn't a desert of ideas but a rainforest lush, interconnected, teeming with life. A single star chart from the ruins makes this undeniable. Greek constellation names sit alongside Arabic star magnitudes, with Tibetan annotations adjusting for high-altitude observation. This isn't the work of isolated scribes, it's the signature of a networked world. What's truly revolutionary is how this redefines globalization. We've been taught it began with 16th century spice routes or 19th century steamships, but the library's ledgers paint an earlier, richer picture. A fragment listing 2 bolts of Samarkand silk traded for the Alexandrian optic scroll reveals a marketplace of ideas as dynamic as any modern economy. And the goods weren't just moving, they were evolving. A Persian medical text found here shows later annotations in Sanskrit prescribing local Himalayan herbs as substitutes for Middle Eastern ingredients, then further notes in Uyghur praising the modified recipe's efficacy. Knowledge wasn't just transmitted, it was refined through collaboration, like an open-source project spanning deserts and mountain passes. The real darkness wasn't in the era, but in our perception of it. While Europe's wars and plagues dominate textbooks, quiet revolutions were unfolding elsewhere. A Buddhist monk in this very library might have studied Aristotle's logic alongside Nagarjuna's paradoxes, while a Nestorian trader compared Christian liturgical music with Persian modal scales. The fire that nearly erased this place also exposed our blind spot. For too long, we've measured history by a single yardstick, missing the brilliance flickering beyond Europe's borders. The library's ashes are a corrective proof that the medieval world wasn't waiting for the Renaissance to awaken. It was already alight, its torch carried by merchants, monks, and scholars who knew no borders, only horizons. And that's the deepest irony. The term Dark Ages was coined by scholars who saw their own era as enlightened. Yet those same critics depended on translations of Arabic and Greek texts preserved by the very cultures they dismissed. The Mountain Library's survival, even in fragments, turns the narrative upside down. While some kingdoms hoarded knowledge as power, places like this treated it as water, a shared resource to be channeled, not dammed. The charred pages whisper a truth we're only now hearing clearly. Globalization didn't begin when Europe joined the conversation. It merely rediscovered a dialogue that had never stopped. Centuries after flames consumed that mountain library, we're facing eerily similar dangers, only now the threats are digital. Imagine future historians sifting through our era's knowledge, only to find broken links instead of charred parchment, corrupted files where inked manuscripts once lay. The irony is stark. We've built vast digital archives capable of storing humanity's collective wisdom, yet they're just as vulnerable as any medieval scriptorium. Data degrades over time, formats become obsolete, and entire online repositories vanish when funding dries up. Political censorship quietly erases inconvenient histories, while cyberattacks can wipe out centuries of research in milliseconds. We pride ourselves on technological progress, but have we really learned the Mountain Library's hardest lesson? Take Wikipedia as a modern counterpart to those ancient shelves. It's the closest thing we have to a universal library, constantly updated by contributors across the globe, much like how medieval scholars annotated and corrected texts across generations. But unlike parchment, digital entries can disappear with a single edit. In 2019, the Chinese government systematically altered Wikipedia entries about Tiananmen Square. In 2022, Russian state actors flooded Ukrainian history pages with disinformation during the invasion. These aren't just revisions, they're cultural wildfires burning in slow motion. The mountain library's keepers understood that neutrality was their superpower, a lesson our digital platforms are still struggling to grasp. Then there's the silent killer, digital decay. Studies show the average web page lasts just 100 days before vanishing or changing beyond recognition. Early internet pioneers already face a crisis. Floppy disks from the 1980s are crumbling. Early websites are disappearing into link rot, and proprietary file formats from just 20 years ago are becoming unreadable. Contrast this with the mountain library's clay-sealed inks, which survived 8 centuries precisely because they weren't high-tech. There's a painful paradox here. Our most advanced storage systems, cloud servers, magnetic tapes, solid-state drives have lifespans measured in decades, while that 12th century manuscript fragment outlasted them all by a factor of 10. Backups were the mountain library's secret weapon. When fire threatened, they'd already sent copies to sister institutions across the Silk Road. Today's knowledge guardians are reviving this ancient strategy in surprising ways. The Internet Archive's Wayback Machine has preserved over 700 billion web pages, while projects like the GitHub Arctic Code Vault store open-source software in a decommissioned Norwegian coal mine, a digital Svalbard seed vault for code. Even blockchain technology is being repurposed as a censorship-resistant library, with activists uploading banned books as permanent, unalterable transactions. These aren't just technical solutions, they're philosophical ones, recognizing that knowledge survives when it's scattered like dandelion seeds rather than concentrated in vulnerable silos. What would the mountain library scribes make of our predicament? They'd likely marvel at our capacity to store entire libraries on devices smaller than a walnut, but shudder at how easily it could all vanish. Their greatest fear wasn't fire or bandits, but obscurity, the terror that their work might never reach the minds it was meant to nourish. 8 centuries later, we're fighting the same battle with different tools. When Twitter's algorithm surfaces viral misinformation over verified facts, or when paywalls lock away scientific breakthroughs, we're not so far removed from medieval rulers who hoarded knowledge as power. The real test isn't whether we can build bigger archives, but whether we can keep them open, redundant, and resilient, because the next dark age won't come from lost technology, but from forgotten wisdom. Perhaps the most haunting question isn't about our systems, but our priorities. The mountain library's patrons valued knowledge enough to hold precious manuscripts over treacherous peaks. Today, we generate more data in a single hour than they did in a century, but how much of it is truly preserved? Your photos might live on iCloud, but will your grandchildren access them in 50 years? That research paper behind a paywall, will it survive the next platform migration? Unlike clay tablets or vellum, digital artifacts don't gracefully fade. They vanish abruptly, leaving no ghosts in the ashes. Future archaeologists won't painstakingly reassemble our fragments with multispectral imaging. They'll just encounter the blank silence of corrupted hard drives and dead links. Yet there's hope in the parallels. Just as the mountain library's network of traders and scholars ensured no idea was trapped in one place, today's citizen archivists are stepping up. When Turkey blocked Wikipedia in 2017, Turkish students smuggled the entire database out on thumb drives. Ukrainian volunteers are digitally preserving cultural artifacts even as bombs fall. These efforts prove the mountain library's ethos endures. Knowledge belongs to everyone, and its survival depends on ordinary people refusing to let it disappear. The lesson isn't just about storage media, it's about collective responsibility. Those medieval scribes didn't know their work would speak across centuries, but they preserved it anyway. The question we face is simpler and starker. 800 years from now, what will our ashes say about us? The mystery of the library's destruction lingers like smoke in the mountain air, no clear villain, no triumphant conquerors chronicle boasting of its ruin. The evidence is as fragmented as the charred manuscripts themselves. One moment, the scriptorium hummed with scribes copying star charts and medical texts. The next, flames licked at the ceiling beams, swallowing centuries of knowledge in a single, hungry roar. But was it an overturned lamp in a cramped workspace, a bandit's torch during a raid, or something far more deliberate? The ruins whisper contradictions. No scattered treasures suggest plunder, no mass graves hint at violence, just a single, half-melted lockbox holding letters pleading for protection as political storms gathered like someone saw the end coming but couldn't outrun it. Clues hide in the fire's own fingerprints. Forensic archaeologists found the blaze started near the scriptorium, where oil, lamps, and paper made perfect tinder. Yet the pattern of charring hints at something unsettling. Some shelves were emptied before the flames took hold. A cache of Buddhist medical texts was neatly stacked in a stone alcove, their edges singed but intact, as if someone tried to save them mid-chaos. Nearby, a trunk of star charts bore scrape marks, dragged toward an exit that ultimately proved too far. This wasn't the indiscriminate rage of invaders. It was the desperate triage of people who knew exactly what was being lost. The political backdrop adds layers of suspicion. In the decades before the fire, Silk Road trade routes had become battlegrounds. Seljuk Turks clashed with Crusader states, Mongol tribes rallied under Genghis Khan, and sectarian tensions turned caravans into targets. A half-burned ledger mentions gifts to the mountain guards, hinting the library paid for protection. But another fragment, a merchant's letter, warns of new taxes on paper and ink imposed by a local warlord. Had the library's neutrality, its refusal to align with any one faith or faction, made it a threat, or did its very openness, its shelves filled with foreign knowledge, spark puritanical fury? The irony is cruel. The same diversity that made the library a beacon may have marked it for destruction. Then there's the drought. Tree rings from the roof beams show years of parched desperation before the fire. Wells ran dry, caravans stalled, and hunger sharpened tempers. In such times, a repository of parchment and ink might have seemed an obscene luxury. A scribe's note from the final months reads, "The village elders say we hoard candles while children starve." History teaches us that when scarcity grips a society, knowledge burns easily, whether in 12th century mountains or 21st century war zones. The library's end may have been less about ideology than simple, brutal necessity. Perhaps the most haunting possibility is that no one burned it at all. The mountain's thin air and lightning storms made it a tinderbox. A single strike could have ignited the roof while monks slept. Natural disasters have erased far more than human hands ever could. The explosion of Thera, the burning of Rome, the earthquakes that swallowed Alexandria's daughter libraries. Sometimes history's greatest losses come not from malice but from the indifferent flick of nature's wrist. The ambiguity itself is the lesson. We crave tidy narratives, heroes and villains, clear causes and effects. But the past is rarely so obliging. The library's fate mirrors how history obscures its own turning points, leaving us to sift through ashes and guess at the spark. What remains isn't a verdict but a question. Does it matter who lit the match when the real tragedy is how much light was lost? The fire, in the end, didn't just destroy. It rendered the library immortal, a riddle wrapped in soot, reminding us that some truths survive precisely because they refuse to be solved. Deep in the ashes of that mountain library lies a paradox. Destruction became its greatest act of preservation. While flames consumed parchment, they couldn't erase the ideas themselves. texts thought lost survived because they'd already escaped, carried in the memories of travelers, copied into new manuscripts in distant scriptoriums, even whispered between traders around campfires. A single medical treatise burned here might have been replicated in a dozen other libraries along the Silk Road, each version accumulating new insights like a river gathering tributaries. This wasn't just luck, it was design. The library's keepers understood that knowledge only endures when it's set free to wander. Consider the journey of one particular text, Avicenna's Canon of Medicine. Originally penned in Persian, it traveled to this mountain refuge where monks translated it into Tibetan for local healers. From there, Fragments reached a Nestorian physician who carried it to Antioch, blending it with Greek techniques before it sailed to Sicily, where Norman rulers had it rendered into Latin. By the time Renaissance scholars rediscovered it centuries later, the text bore layers of annotation in half a dozen languages, each contributor refining the work like a relay race across time. The original might have burned, but its essence survived because it was never tethered to a single place or tongue. This raises a haunting question for our digital age. What of our wisdom will outlast us? Unlike vellum or clay, our storage mediums are eerily fragile. A medieval scribe's work could survive centuries of neglect, but a hard drive left unattended for a decade may become unreadable. We've built vast clouds of data, yet they evaporate at the slightest disturbance. Corrupted files, abandoned platforms, even corporate decisions to sunset services. Imagine if the mountain library's texts had depended on a single merchant's caravan for survival. That's essentially our predicament, entrusting humanity's collective memory to systems that prioritize profit over permanence. Yet there are glimmers of the old resilience. Open source movements echo the library's ethos, with volunteers translating software manuals into countless languages, just as those monks rendered texts for new audiences. Wikipedia's decentralized editing mirrors the way Silk Road scholars amended manuscripts across generations. Even blockchain technology, for all its hype, revives an ancient principle, distributing knowledge so widely that no single point of failure can erase it. The lesson isn't about the medium clay tablets or cloud servers, but about mindset. When the people of Nineveh buried their library under the ruins of their palace, they grasped what we're still relearning. Survival demands both duplication and dispersal. Perhaps the most profound legacy of those charred pages is their insistence on utility. Texts weren't preserved because they were rare or beautiful, but because they solved problems, whether calculating interest rates or treating fevers. Today, as we obsess over backing up selfies and viral videos, we might ask, what are we saving that future generations will actually need? The Mountain Library's catalog was ruthlessly practical, prioritizing star charts over poetry, medical manuals over royal decrees. Its keepers understood that knowledge earns immortality through use, not just admiration. In the end, the fire did something unexpected. It purified the collection. What survived weren't the lavish illuminated gospels or gilded astrolabes, but the working texts dog-eared, annotated, repaired with makeshift patches. Their scars proved their worth. As we face our own cultural fires, from climate chaos to digital decay, we might take comfort in this. It's not the pristine artifacts that shape history, but the well-thumbed pages passed hand to hand, the ideas too vital to abandon. The library's true triumph wasn't defying the flames, but ensuring that even in ashes, its light never fully went out. Long before empires drew borders or explorers charted oceans, the real architects of globalization were already at work. Not kings or conquerors, but anonymous merchants with worn sandals and monks with ink-stained fingers. The Mountain Library's ledgers don't record grand declarations or treaties. They list the quiet transactions that stitched continents together. 3 bolts of Bukharan cotton for a Kashmiri medical scroll, 1 silver dirham for copying star charts to navigate the Taklamakan. These weren't just trades, they were the first drafts of a connected world written in the margins of history. Take that half-burned customs log from 1182, its entries meticulous despite the soot. It documents saffron from Kashmir exchanged for Venetian glass beads, Tibetan musk traded for Egyptian papyrus. Each line a snapshot of a system already centuries old by Marco Polo's birth. The real revelation, these weren't luxury goods for elites. A scribbled note beside an entry for paper reads, "For village school payable in honey and salt." Globalization didn't begin as a top-down imperial project. It grew from the ground up, fueled by herders needing better veterinary techniques and farmers seeking drought-resistant seeds. The library's shelves held the receipts, a practical knowledge moving at the speed of camel caravans. What made this early web so resilient was its informality. Unlike later colonial trade empires with their monopolies and navies, this system ran on trust and reciprocity. A charred letter from a Persian merchant to his Tibetan partner captures the ethos. The astrolabe you requested is with the next caravan. No payment until your nephew verifies its accuracy. Reputation mattered more than royal seals. Even the library's catalogue reflected this. Texts were tagged not by origin but by reliability, with marginal notes like verified by 3 travelers from Samarkand or discarded per Armenian merchant's warning. Knowledge wasn't just transmitted, it was crowdsourced across cultures. The monks who tended these shelves understood their role as curators, not gatekeepers. A stunning example survives in the guest books, fragile slips where visitors recorded what they copied and what they left behind. One from 1194 lists a Uyghur trader depositing a Chinese compass manual while borrowing a Byzantine treatise on horse medicine. Another shows a Nestorian monk adding Syriac translations of Indian arithmetic texts to the collection. This was open-source globalization, where every traveler was both student and teacher, adding threads to the tapestry. Perhaps most remarkably, this system thrived without maps in the modern sense. Traders navigated using poetry. A surviving fragment of a route guide describes the journey from Aleppo to Dunhuang not with coordinates but through verse, where the twin poplars whisper like scribes, turn east until the mountains wear the sunset like a saffron robe. These lyrical instructions, passed down in dozens of languages, anchored geography in shared sensory experience. The library preserved hundreds of such guides, their margins crammed with updates from later travelers. Poplar Grove felled by storm, seek the new landmark, a cairn shaped like a sleeping camel. The true legacy of these anonymous connectors lies in what they didn't do. They didn't standardize or homogenize. A Buddhist sutra copied here might gain Persian floral motifs in its margins but keep its Sanskrit core intact. A Greek medical text would acquire Tibetan folk remedies as footnotes without erasing the original theories. This early globalization wasn't about flattening differences but weaving them into something stronger. A lesson etched in the library's very walls, where carbonized fragments still whisper in a dozen tongues, each voice distinct yet harmonized. The team of archaeologists working in the shadow of those scorched walls faced an impossible choice, not just which fragments to save, but which stories to condemn to oblivion. With limited time and resources, every decision carried the weight of centuries. A crumbling Sanskrit medical text or a nearly intact Persian star chart. A merchant's ledger detailing trade routes or a child's practice slate with shaky handwriting. These weren't academic exercises, they were ethical triage where the act of preservation became its own form of editing history. One poignant example survives in their field notes. A junior conservator spent 3 painstaking days reconstructing a single page from a Buddhist sutra, only to discover it overlapped with known copies in Tibet. Meanwhile, a water-stained scrap nearby, initially dismissed as debris, turned out to be the only surviving fragment of a Sogdian merchant's contract, revealing previously unknown trade links between Samarkand and the Himalayas. The team had to make a brutal calculation: save the redundant sacred text or the singular commercial record. Their choice to prioritize the contract wasn't about spiritual versus secular value, but about filling gaps in our understanding of how ideas traveled. That scrap of parchment now rewrites economic history, proving loans and credit systems stretched farther along the Silk Road than anyone guessed. The dilemma cuts deeper when you consider what was lost simply because it seemed unimportant in the moment. Early excavations focused on beautifully illuminated manuscripts, leaving behind what looked like mundane scraps: shopping lists, laundry records, scribbled memos between librarians. Only later did researchers realize these everyday fragments held priceless clues. A charcoal-smudged to-do list included a reminder to order paper from Kashgar via the Uyghur trader, confirming long-suspected supply chains. Another note, pay the scribe from Cotton Extra for working through the snows, offered rare evidence of labor conditions in medieval scriptoria. The very ordinariness of these texts made them vulnerable, reminding us that history isn't just written in grand decrees, but in the quiet paperwork of survival. Even the tools of preservation carry bias. Multispectral imaging works wonders on ink, but can't recover texts written in organic dyes that vanished completely. Carbon dating requires sacrificing slivers of material, sometimes destroying the very artifact you're trying to date. One heartbreaking journal entry describes a conservator accidentally pulverizing a fragile leaf of Uyghur poetry while attempting to separate stuck pages. These aren't just technical failures, they're reminders that every act of recovery is also an act of transformation. The library we know today isn't exactly what existed before the fire, it's what survived the flames, the elements, and now our own imperfect attempts at salvation. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies in what wasn't found at all. The library's catalogues mention texts we'll never read. A compendium of monsoon winds, reportedly compiled by Arab and Chinese navigators working together. A medical dialogue between a Byzantine physician and a Tibetan healer. These vanished works hint at connections even more astonishing than the ones we've pieced together. Their absence forces us to confront a humbling truth. The mountain library's ashes don't just show us how much was saved. They measure irrevocably how much was lost. In the end, the archaeologist's choices mirror those of the original librarians. Just as medieval scribes selectively copied texts based on demand and urgency, modern scholars must decide which fragments deserve their limited resources. The difference is scale. Where the librarians worked with quills and patience, today's teams wield spectral imaging and artificial intelligence. But the essential question remains the same: what knowledge matters enough to outlast time's relentless winnowing? The answer, then as now, isn't found in vaults or algorithms, but in the values we bring to the work. Every rescued fragment is a bet placed on the future, a wager that someone, centuries from now, will still care about the whispers we fought to save from the dark. Mountains have always been more than just rock and ice. They're silent archivists, preserving what the lowlands forget. While empires clashed in the valleys below, this high-altitude library became a time capsule, sheltered by thin air and sheer isolation. It's a pattern as old as civilization itself. Remote places guard the most fragile threads of history. The Ethiopian highlands hid illuminated gospels while Europe plunged into war. The cliffs of Dunhuang sealed away 50,000 manuscripts for a millennium. Even now, the Andes cradle frozen Incan mummies, their stories locked in glacier ice. There's something about altitude that seems to pause time, as if the very act of climbing lifts artifacts beyond the reach of decay and human recklessness. Consider the physics of forgetting. In bustling cities, knowledge is constantly overwritten, palaces built atop ruins, new scrolls scraping clean old vellum. But mountains enforce a kind of stillness. The library's manuscripts survived precisely because no conqueror bothered to climb that high. No zealot cared to burn what they couldn't see. Isolation became its armor, just as it did for the Dead Sea Scrolls tucked into desert caves or the medieval Icelandic sagas preserved by volcanic isolation. These places aren't just hiding spots, they're natural vaults leveraging geography to outlast politics. Yet the real mystery isn't what we've found, it's what still waits. For every discovered trove like this library, there are surely dozens more clinging to cliffs or buried under glacial till. Take the rumored Buddhist libraries of Mustang, their sealed chambers allegedly packed with untouched texts. Or the ghost monasteries of the Caucasus, where shepherds occasionally stumble upon frescoed walls peeking through landslides. Even the library's own catalogue mentions the Eastern Vault, a storage chamber that archaeologists have yet to locate. Could it still be there, tucked into some forgotten crevasse, its contents frozen mid-sentence? The urgency of these searches grows by the day. Climate change is melting glaciers that once guarded secrets, revealing and then destroying organic artifacts in the same breath. In Norway, Viking relics emerge from retreating ice only to rot within weeks. In the Himalayas, entire manuscript collections mold away in suddenly humid caves. The very forces that preserved these treasures for centuries are now unraveling, turning mountains from time capsules into hourglasses. We're in a race against thaw and decay, scrambling to document what the ice has held safe long enough for us to deserve it. What makes these high-altitude caches so electrifying is their democracy. Unlike royal tombs or state archives, they often preserve ordinary voices, merchant ledgers, children's slates, laundry lists. A scrap of parchment from the library's ruins records a monk's complaint about his sore back from copying texts, while another lists the cost of ink in chicken eggs. These aren't the grand narratives of kings, but the whispered asides of history, the kind that crumble fastest in lowland floods or wars. The mountains, in their indifference, saved what humans might have discarded. There's a lesson here for our digital age. We've built vast clouds of data, but they're oddly ephemeral compared to parchment in a dry cave. The library's survival hints at an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the best way to preserve knowledge isn't to centralize it, but to scatter it to stash copies in the Earth's natural safes. As we ponder backups and servers, we might look to these accidental archivists, the peaks and caves that outlasted every human system. Their quiet resilience begs the question, what are we leaving on high ground for the future to find? That Buddhist sutra translated into Persian, then annotated by a Jewish merchant, it wasn't just a sacred text. It was the 12th century equivalent of a viral meme. The same forces that propel today's internet jokes across continents, adaptation, remixing, and sheer utility, once carried medical manuals and star charts along the Silk Road. Think about it, a catchy meme thrives because it's flexible enough to be localized. Swap the caption, tweak the image, and suddenly it resonates in Mumbai or Montreal. The Mountain Library's manuscripts operated on the same principle. A Greek geometry theorem didn't just get copied verbatim, it gained Tibetan diagrams in the margins, Persian commentary between the lines, and Uyghur mnemonics to help traders remember formulas. Each iteration made the idea stickier, more shareable, just like adding the perfect hashtag to a trending post. Look closer at those charred fragments, and you'll spot the medieval version of a retweet. A Sanskrit medical text survives with a note in Arabic, shared with the physician from Cordoba, who improved the fever remedy with Andalusi herbs. The original idea traveled, got upgraded, and pinged back across the network exactly how a modern Twitter thread evolves as experts add corrections. Even the library's catalog mirrored today's algorithm-driven feeds. Texts weren't ranked by prestige but by engagement. Scrolls with the most annotations and copies got prime shelf space, while lesser-used works drifted to the corners. Popularity wasn't about likes or shares, but about how many caravan stops a text could survive. The real magic happened in translation, not just of words but of context. A Chinese poem about plum blossoms might get repurposed as a Persian metaphor for resilience, then reworked again by a Byzantine scribe into a hymn. This wasn't lost in translation chaos. It was creative reinvention, like a TikTok sound remixed across genres. The library's ledgers even track this cultural sampling. One entry lists payment to a monk for rendering the Indian arithmetic scroll into rhyme for the children of traders. Imagine that an entire mathematical concept going viral because someone set it to verse, making it easier to memorize around campfires. What separated fleeting fads from enduring hits? Utility. A meme dies when it stops being relatable, and the same ruthless selectivity shaped the library's collection. Astronomical charts survived not because they were pretty, but because they helped merchants time their journeys. Medical texts spread farthest when they offered cures for universal ailments like broken bones or dysentery. Even the Buddhist sutras that filled whole shelves had practical value. Their calming verses were reportedly used to soothe caravan animals during storms. The texts that went truly viral weren't the most ornate, but the most adaptable, solving problems from Samarkand to Sicily. Today's digital platforms didn't invent this ecosystem, they just accelerated it. The same way a meme mutates as it jumps from Twitter to Instagram to WhatsApp, a Persian medical diagram might gain Chinese pulse diagnostics in one copy and Byzantine surgical notes in another. The library's fire froze this process mid-spread, capturing ideas in motion, half translated, half annotated, forever on the verge of their next iteration. It's a reminder that virality isn't about the medium, whether parchment or pixels. It's about the human itch to share, improve, and pass along whatever makes life a little clearer, funnier, or easier to navigate one caravan stop or one click at a time. What if the burned mountain library isn't an anomaly but a clue? For every ash-preserved manuscript we've found, there could be a dozen more hiding in plain sight, not just in remote caves, but in the overlooked corners of familiar places. Take Venice's Marciana Library, where a clerk in 1982 stumbled upon a bundle of letters between a silk merchant and his Himalayan agent, detailing the exchange of medical texts for lapis lazuli. Or the attic of a Damascus mosque, where restorers found 13th century star charts annotated with Tibetan wind directions. These aren't random survivals, they're breadcrumbs leading us toward a radical truth. The medieval world was stitched together by threads we're only beginning to trace. Consider the quiet revolution brewing in unlikely places. A team scanning Vatican archives with hyperspectral imaging recently uncovered something extraordinary. A palimpsest where a 10th century Greek geometry text had been scrubbed away to make room for a Persian translation of that same text, complete with margin notes debating its proofs in Latin. This wasn't destruction, it was dialogue, evidence of scholars across faiths and cultures wrestling with shared ideas. Similar discoveries are rewriting history's timeline. A shipwreck off Java yielded bronze mirrors from Kyoto packed alongside Egyptian medical scrolls, their wax seals still bearing the fingerprints of the monk who wrapped them against the damp. Each find chips away at the myth of isolated civilizations, revealing instead a tapestry of constant, purposeful exchange. The real adventure lies in reimagining how we search. For centuries, historians focused on grand libraries and royal courts, but the mountain library's legacy teaches us to look elsewhere, to merchant ledgers, children's school slates, even garbage pits. In Samarkand, archaeologists sifting through a medieval tannery's waste discovered hundreds of scrap parchment pieces, discarded drafts where scribes practiced writing in multiple scripts, their shaky Arabic letters giving way to confident Uyghur. These aren't official records, they're the equivalent of finding a modern student's notebook filled with half-learned phrases in 3 languages. Suddenly, we're not just studying trade routes, but literacy itself, how ordinary people moved between intellectual worlds long before globalization became a buzzword. Technology is turning this hunt into high-stakes detective work. Artificial intelligence now scans digitized manuscripts for fingerprints invisible to the human eye, the unique quill strokes of a particular scribe, the chemical signature of inks from specific regions. One algorithm tracing these markers recently made a startling connection. A copy of Avicenna's canon in a Spanish monastery shares scribble quirks with Buddhist medical texts from the same period in Afghanistan. The likely explanation: a single multilingual scholar working along the Silk Road, their handwriting threading through texts we'd assumed were worlds apart. It's as if we've been handed a decoder ring for history's hidden hyperlinks, but the most thrilling discoveries may still await, not in vaults or museums, but in living traditions. In a remote Pamiri village, ethnographers recorded an elder reciting a ballad about the house of 1,000 books where healers spoke in the tongues of all nations. Local lore claimed it was pure legend until researchers matched descriptions in the verse to the mountain library's layout. Elsewhere, a family in Bukhara still prepares a saffron-infused remedy for night blindness using a method identical to one found in the library's ashes, passed down through generations with the instruction: this came from the high place where the scribes traded light. Such threads, stretching unbroken across 8 centuries, suggest we've barely scratched the surface of what endures. This isn't just about filling gaps in history books, it's about reclaiming a lost vision of possibility. When we uncover a Tibetan astrologer's notes on a Hebrew zodiac scroll, or a Genos merchant's diary quoting Sufi poetry, we're not just adding footnotes. We're witnessing the birth of something extraordinary, a way of moving through the world that embraces curiosity over conquest, synthesis over supremacy. The Mountain Library's true legacy isn't the knowledge it saved, but the model it offers, proof that even in fractured times, people found ways to build bridges across every divide. Now, the blank spots on our maps aren't just voids waiting to be filled. They're invitations to look again, to question what else we've missed, and to wonder what other stories might be waiting, like embers in the ashes, for the right breath to bring them back to life. The charred fragments of that mountain library didn't just survive, they sparked a movement. Today, you can trace their legacy with a few clicks, diving into digital archives where medieval manuscripts breathe new life. The British Library's digitized collection lets you zoom in on 12th century star charts so closely you can see where the scribe's quill hesitated. Over at the Library of Congress, interactive scans of Persian medical texts reveal layered marginalia notes in Hebrew, Tibetan, and Arabic debating dosages for fever remedies. These aren't just static images, they're invitations. Tilt your screen to catch the indigo sheen of dyes traded from Isfahan to the Himalayas, or use augmented reality to unfold a virtual recreation of that burned library star map. its constellations glowing as they would have appeared to a Silk Road traveler in 1190. But here's where the story gets personal. Modern mountain libraries aren't just preserving history, they're creating it. In the foothills of the Andes, the Quipu project digitizes indigenous knowledge using blockchain, ensuring Quechua elders' oral histories can't be erased. Meanwhile, the Arctic World Archive, buried deep in a Norwegian glacier, stores open-source texts on ultra-resistant film, designed to outlast nuclear war. These aren't sci-fi fantasies, they're direct descendants of that medieval scriptorium's ethos. When you support groups like the Endangered Libraries Initiative, you're not just funding scanners, you're backing modern-day scribes who brave war zones to rescue Yazidi manuscripts or train AI to reconstruct shredded Uyghur poetry. The real magic happens when these threads connect. A crowdsourcing project called Fragmentarium enlists volunteers to match orphaned manuscript pieces like that charred Buddhist sutra from the Mountain Library, with their missing halves in collections from Tokyo to Toledo. Last year, a dentist in Buenos Aires spotted a floral motif on a digitized scrap that reunited two halves of a Persian love poem separated by 8 centuries. Elsewhere, the Silk Road Cooking Project revives recipes from those very trade ledgers, where saffron traded for star charts now flavors dishes in Istanbul and Xi'an pop-ups. History isn't just something we study, it's something we taste, touch, and reassemble together. Your role in this isn't passive. When you explore these archives, you become part of the chain, like that medieval merchant who carried a medical scroll over the Pamirs. Bookmark the Digital Silk Road's interactive trade maps, where clicking a spice route reveals the exact folio describing its hazards in a traveler's diary. Download the Bodleian Libraries app to collect virtual fragments, earning badges for spotting connections between texts, or join a transcription sprint where gamers and grad students race to decode marginalia, like last summer's discovery of a Nestorian hymn scribbled inside a Euclid manuscript, proving faith and math shared shelf space. The Mountain Library's fire taught us one unshakable truth: knowledge survives when it's touched by many hands. Today's hands might hold phones instead of quills, but the mission hasn't changed. Every time you zoom in on a digitized palimpsest, every dollar you give to a manuscript rescue fund, you're adding your voice to an 800-year-old conversation. The parchment fragments may be silent, but the ideas, they're still singing, waiting for you to lean closer and echo them forward. The burned library's legacy isn't just about what was lost, it's about what refuses to stay buried. Those ashes whisper a truth we've forgotten. Borders were never walls but bridges. Look closely at the fragments, and you'll see fingerprints from a dozen cultures: Persian mathematicians correcting Greek star charts, Tibetan monks annotating Sanskrit medical texts, Venetian merchants scribbling price conversions in Arabic numerals. This wasn't chaos, it was collaboration on a scale that would make modern diplomats blush. The library's real treasure wasn't its parchment, but its proof. When we stop policing ideas and start passing them hand to hand, humanity moves forward. Think about the scribes who worked by lamplight, copying texts they'd never fully understand for readers they'd never meet. They weren't just transmitters, they were believers in something bigger. A single sheet from the ruins captures this spirit. A Buddhist sutra translated into Uyghur by a Nestorian Christian, with a Jewish merchant's note in the margin praising its wisdom. No one asked for credentials or visas. The only passport an idea needed was its usefulness. Fast forward 8 centuries, and we've built firewalls where they built footnotes, algorithms that narrow our worlds instead of expanding them. The library challenges us to ask, what are we filtering out, whose voices aren't making it through our digital gates? And let's talk about the fire itself, not as an ending, but as an unexpected preserver. While flames consumed the library's wooden beams, they baked delicate inks into clay, creating accidental time capsules. There's a metaphor here for our fragile digital age. We've traded parchment for pixels, assuming permanence, but a power surge can erase what a wildfire couldn't. Yet the library's survival hints at a solution: redundancy. Its texts lived on because they'd already escaped, carried in saddlebags, memorized by travelers, copied in distant scriptoria. Today, when activists upload banned books to blockchain or hackers archive threatened tweets, they're following the same playbook: scatter the seeds and some will take root. This isn't just history, it's a mirror. Those medieval traders arguing over star charts in the library's debate chamber. They're the ancestors of today's open-source developers refining code across time zones. The monk who patiently rendered Euclid's geometry into Tibetan wasn't just translating. He was building what we'd now call an open access platform. Even the library's funding model, supported by merchants who saw knowledge as infrastructure, not commodity, feels eerily modern. The past isn't a foreign country, it's a workshop where we're still assembling the same tools, just with different names. So here's the real question the ashes leave us: what will our fires preserve? 800 years from now, will archaeologists sift through server farms and find traces of our collective wisdom? Or just the digital detritus of cat videos and clickbait? The Mountain Library's keepers made a conscious choice. They curated for survival, prioritizing medical texts over royal decrees, star charts over love poems. Not because beauty didn't matter, but because they knew what future generations would need most. As we drown in data, we're facing the same triage. Every tweet we archive, every cloud backup we fund, every Wikipedia edit we make, these are our offerings to the flames, our bet on what deserves to outlast us. Hit subscribe not just for more stories, but to join the chain. You're now part of the same lineage as those Silk Road scribes, a keeper of light in unpredictable times. Because history isn't about looking back, it's about passing forward, and the next chapter, it's already being written in the margins, between the lines, wherever curious minds refuse to let the fire have the last word.